there was an empire which lost their brave 300 and their king, not for conquest, not for glory alone, but for something far quieter and far more enduring, for the sake of truth, for the sake of duty, and for the idea that some things are worth standing for, even when the outcome is already known. This is the story of Sparta, but not only Sparta, because like all real stories, it begins far away from the place where it will be remembered, in lands that seem distant, in decisions that feel small at the time, and in moments where no one yet realizes that history has already begun to turn. Before we arrive at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, before we meet the men who will stand there in silence with shields raised and eyes fixed forward, we must first travel east into the heart of an empire so vast that it stretched across continents, across deserts, rivers, mountains, and cities that had stood long before Greece itself had found its voice. In that empire, far from the sea winds and rocky coasts of the Greek world, an order was given, not shouted, not announced with drama, but written carefully, repeated precisely, and sent outward with a certainty that did not require explanation. The command moved along the royal roads of Persia, carried by riders who did not pause except to change horses, moving across dry plains where the wind lifted dust into the air, through valleys where small settlements watched them pass without question, and into great administrative centers where officials received the message and immediately began to act. The words were simple, but their meaning was enormous, as they called for men, for ships, for food, for animals, for tools, for everything required not just to fight a war, but to move an entire world toward a single direction. And as the message spread, the empire responded in the only way it knew how, with obedience, with organization, and with a quiet understanding that this was not a request, but an expectation. At the center of this movement stood a man whose position required him to think, not in days or weeks, but in years and generations, a king who had inherited not only the power of his father, but also the unfinished weight of his ambitions. Xerxes the First, ruler of Persia, who now faced a question that could not be ignored. His father, Darius I, had once turned his attention toward the western lands of Greece, expecting, as empires often do, that resistance would be brief and submission inevitable. Yet instead of victory, he had encountered something unexpected. A defeat at the Battle of Marathon. A defeat that did not threaten the empire's survival, but did something perhaps more dangerous. It created an example. And in an empire built on authority and perception, an example of successful resistance could spread quietly, influencing thoughts, shaping decisions, and planting ideas that might grow into future challenges. Xerxes did not inherit this situation in isolation, because the Persian court was not a place of silence, but one of voices, of advisors, nobles, and relatives, who each carried their own perspective, their own interests, and their own understanding of what the empire should do next. Some argued for stability, suggesting that the empire was already vast enough, that maintaining order within its borders required focus and restraint, and that pushing further into distant lands might bring unnecessary risk. Others, however, spoke with a different tone, reminding the king that allowing resistance to stand unanswered could weaken the perception of Persian power, that the memory of Marathon could inspire others, and that a response was not simply an option, but a necessity. In such an environment, the decision that emerged was not sudden, but formed slowly, shaped by discussions, by expectations, and by the quiet logic of empire, until it became clear that Xerxes would not merely return to Greece, but would do so in a way that removed all doubt, in a way that would demonstrate power so overwhelming that resistance would no longer appear as a viable choice. This was not just a campaign, but a statement, one that would be written, not in words, but in movement, in numbers, and in the visible presence of an army unlike anything the Greek world had ever seen. The preparation that followed did not resemble the hurried gathering of forces, but instead unfolded with a deliberate and almost methodical precision, as each region of the empire contributed according to its strengths. In Egypt, vast quantities of grain were harvested, measured, and stored, ensuring that the army would not depend entirely on the lands it crossed. In Phoenician ports, skilled shipbuilders shaped timber into warships, carefully assembling hulls that would later carry men across uncertain waters. In Babylon, officials recorded supplies, livestock, and resources, creating systems of distribution that would support the movement of thousands. Across distant territories, soldiers were gathered, not as a single uniform force, but as a collection of peoples, each bringing their own weapons, their own fighting styles, and their own traditions into a single, unified direction. What emerged from this process was not simply an army, but something far more complex, a moving system that required constant balance, where food mattered as much as weapons, where water determined routes, and where organization held everything together. The sheer scale of this force placed pressure on every part of the system, because an army of such size could not simply march forward without consideration, as wells could run dry, fields could be stripped, and disorder could spread if control was not maintained. Xerxes understood this, and so the campaign was designed not only with strength in mind, but with structure, ensuring that each step forward was supported, that each movement was sustainable, and that the journey itself reflected the power of the empire. Yet beyond the practical concerns of logistics and supply, there was another layer to this preparation, one that spoke to the image Xerxes wished to create. The campaign was meant to be seen, to be understood not only by those within the empire, but also by those who stood outside it. Engineering projects were undertaken not merely for necessity, but as demonstrations of capability, as statements that the king could reshape the environment itself to serve his purpose. A canal was carved through land where storms had once destroyed Persian ships, reducing future risk while signaling control over nature. At the narrow stretch of water known as the Hellespont, bridges of boats were constructed, tied together, anchored carefully, and laid with planks so that men, animals, and wagons could cross as though the sea itself had become a road. When the first attempt at this crossing failed, when storms broke the structure apart and threatened to delay the entire campaign, The response was immediate, not with hesitation, but with renewed effort. Stronger materials, tighter planning, and greater attention to detail, because failure in such a moment carried meaning, and Xerxes could not allow that meaning to take hold. The second attempt succeeded, and when the crossing was finally ready, the movement that followed became one of the most extraordinary sights of the ancient world, as lines of soldiers, animals, and wagons stretched across the water, moving steadily, not with excitement or noise, but with the quiet persistence of something that knew its own scale. As the army entered Europe, the campaign shifted from preparation to execution, and with each step forward, the presence of Persia became more real to those who lay ahead. The army moved along routes that allowed access to water and supplies, supported by a fleet that traveled along the coast, ensuring that heavy equipment and additional provisions could be transported efficiently. The movement affected the land itself, as fields were trampled, resources were consumed, and local populations were drawn into the process, either through cooperation or necessity. At the same time, news of the advancing force began to spread, carried by travelers, scouts, and messengers, each report adding detail, each retelling shaping perception, until the idea of the Persian invasion began to take form in the minds of the Greek cities. In those cities, far to the west, leaders listened carefully, weighing what they heard against what they knew, understanding that this was not a raid or a limited campaign, but something designed to overwhelm, something that would test not only their strength, but their ability to work together. Yet at this moment, before alliances were fully formed, before plans were finalized, and before the narrow pass of Thermopylae became the center of attention, there existed a brief and quiet space in time, a moment where the outcome had not yet been decided, where the movement of an empire had begun, but the response to it was still taking shape. And as you rest and let this story settle, imagine that slow, steady advance, the distant sound of footsteps carried across land and water, moving closer with each passing day, while somewhere ahead, unseen and unprepared, a small group of men continues their ordinary lives, unaware that they will soon stand at the edge of something that will be remembered long after the sound of marching has faded into silence. As the great movement of the Persian Empire advanced steadily westward, its presence did not arrive all at once in Greece, but instead appeared first as a series of distant reports, fragments of information carried by traders, travelers, and scouts who had seen something unusual on the roads, something larger than the routine movement of soldiers or goods, something that suggested preparation on a scale that few could fully comprehend at first. These reports entered the Greek world quietly, spoken in marketplaces, repeated in harbors, discussed in council chambers, and questioned in private conversations, where uncertainty shaped every interpretation, because no one could yet see the full picture. And yet everyone could sense that something significant was approaching. In city after city, officials listened as messengers described the same unfolding reality, that Xerxes I had crossed into Europe, that an army of extraordinary size was moving along the coast, supported by a fleet that mirrored its progress at sea, and that this was not a temporary expedition, but a deliberate and sustained advance. The details varied with each telling, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes incomplete, but the core message remained consistent enough to create a shared understanding among Greek leaders that the Persian Empire was coming not to test, but to decide, and that the outcome would depend not only on strength, but on preparation, coordination, and timing. For the Greek world, this realization presented an immediate and complex challenge, because Greece was not a single unified state, but a collection of independent city-states, each with its own government, its own priorities, and its own history of rivalry with its neighbors. And the idea of cooperation, while not impossible, required overcoming deep-rooted tensions that had developed over generations. In ordinary times, these cities competed for influence, for trade, and for prestige, and their disagreements could escalate into conflict. Yet now they faced a situation that demanded something different, a recognition that no single city, no matter how strong, could stand alone against the scale of what was approaching. Among these cities, Athens responded with a sense of urgency shaped by both fear and foresight, because its leaders had already spent years debating the future of the city, and those debates had led to a decision that would now prove critical. At the center of this preparation stood Themistocles, a figure whose influence had grown not through force, but through persuasion, as he had argued that Athens should invest in a strong navy, not as a temporary measure, but as a foundation for its security and power. His argument had not been universally accepted at first, as many citizens questioned the cost and the focus on sea power. Yet the discovery of silver in the mines of Larion provided the means to act, and under his guidance, Athens had begun building a fleet of triremes, fast and maneuverable warships designed for coordinated naval combat. Now, as news of the Persian advance reached the city, that earlier decision began to take on new meaning, as shipyards filled with activity, with workers sanding planks, shaping timbers, and fitting metal components, while crews practiced rowing in synchronized movements, learning to function as a single unit, where timing and discipline mattered more than individual strength. The preparation extended beyond the ships themselves, as men who might never have considered themselves soldiers found new roles as rowers, contributing to the defense of their city in a way that reflected the broader structure of Athenian society, where participation in the fleet became both a duty and a source of identity. While Athens focused on the sea, Sparta approached the situation with a different rhythm, one shaped by a social system that placed military readiness at its core, where citizens were trained from a young age to function as part of a disciplined collective, and where the expectations of service were woven into daily life. Spartan society was built around structure and tradition, and while this created a formidable fighting force, it also meant that decisions could not be made impulsively, as religious obligations, civic laws, and internal stability all influenced when and how the army could move. This balance between readiness and restraint created a tension as the Persian threat grew closer, because the need for action was clear, Yet the timing of that action was constrained by factors that could not simply be ignored. As reports continued to arrive, the realization spread that coordination between cities would be essential, leading to the gathering of representatives from across the Greek world in meetings where discussion replaced rivalry, at least temporarily, as leaders debated strategy, shared information, and attempted to form a unified response. These gatherings, particularly those held at Corinth, became the foundation of what would emerge as a defensive alliance, where decisions had to balance the strengths and concerns of different cities, assigning roles based on capability while maintaining a sense of shared purpose. In these discussions, it became clear that geography would play a decisive role, because the Persian advantage in numbers could only be countered by limiting the space in which those numbers could be used effectively. The Greek leaders studied their landscape not as passive observers, but as strategists, searching for a location where a smaller force could hold against a larger one, where discipline and formation could offset scale, and where time could be gained for further preparation. Their attention settled on a narrow coastal passage known as Thermopylae, a place where the mountains pressed close to the sea, creating a natural bottleneck that could restrict movement and force any advancing army into a confined space. The choice of Thermopylae was not made in isolation, because it was closely linked to the position of the Greek fleet, which would operate nearby at Artemisium, where the narrow straits would similarly limit the effectiveness of the Persian navy. Together, these two positions formed a coordinated strategy, where success depended on both holding the land pass and controlling the sea routes, as failure in one would expose the other, and the balance between them required careful timing and communication. Within Athens, the implementation of this plan required difficult decisions, as the focus on naval defense meant that many citizens would leave their homes to serve on ships, while others prepared for the possibility that the city itself might not be defensible against a land invasion of such scale. Assemblies were held where citizens gathered to debate, to question, and ultimately to decide, with speeches that addressed not only strategy, but identity, asking what it meant to be Athenian in a moment where survival depended on collective action rather than individual security. In Sparta, the question took a different form, centering on leadership and commitment, as the decision to send forces north carried both symbolic and practical significance. The responsibility would fall to Leonidas I, one of Sparta's kings, a man shaped by the same system as those he commanded, experienced in its discipline, and aware of the expectations that came with his position. His role was not simply to lead soldiers, but to represent Sparta itself, to demonstrate that the city was committed to the alliance, even under constraints that limited the size of the force he could initially bring. The decision that emerged was measured yet decisive, as Leonidas would lead an advance force to Thermopylae, not as the full strength of Sparta, but as a signal, a commitment placed early in the path of the Persian advance, intended to hold the pass long enough for additional forces to gather and for the broader strategy to take shape. This force would include a select group of Spartan warriors, chosen not only for their strength, but for their experience and reliability. Men who understood the demands of formation fighting and who could maintain discipline under pressure. As preparations continued across Greece, the atmosphere shifted from uncertainty to anticipation as roads filled with men traveling toward muster points, carrying their armor, their provisions, and their expectations, leaving behind fields, families, and routines that could not continue unchanged in the face of what was coming. In towns and cities, rituals were performed, offerings were made, and decisions were justified, not only in practical terms, but within the framework of belief and tradition that shaped Greek society, where divine favor and human action were closely connected. And so, while the Persian army continued its steady advance, moving closer with each passing day, the Greek world, divided yet increasingly coordinated, began to prepare for a confrontation that would test not only their strength, but their ability to act as something they had rarely been before, a unified force standing against a common threat, with the narrow pass of Thermopylae waiting quietly ahead, still empty for now, but soon to become the place where all of these decisions, movements, and expectations would converge. By the time the decisions had been made and the plans agreed upon, the story that had begun far away in the vast administrative networks of the Persian Empire had now reached a very different kind of place. A smaller world of stone streets, disciplined lives, and traditions that shaped every action. And it was here, in the structured society of Sparta, that the response to the coming invasion took on a form that would later be remembered not for its size, but for its clarity. The news of the Persian advance had already been discussed, weighed, and understood in practical terms. And yet there remained one question that could not be avoided. Who would go first, and how many could be sent without placing the city itself at risk? Because even in a moment of external danger, Sparta could not ignore its internal balance, its dependence on order, and the constant awareness that leaving the city too exposed could create dangers of its own. At the center of this decision stood Leonidas the First, a man who did not rise to his position through ambition or dramatic display, but through the structured inheritance of Spartan kingship and the lifelong discipline that shaped every citizen within the system. And as he listened to the reports brought back from councils, from envoys, and from the sacred words spoken at Delphi, he understood that the moment required not hesitation, but acceptance. The message of the oracle had already framed the situation in stark and unavoidable terms, suggesting that Sparta would either face destruction or the loss of a king. And while such words carried religious weight, they also provided something more immediate, a clear path through uncertainty, a way to transform fear into decision, and to align duty with action in a manner that left little room for debate. Leonidas did not respond with grand speeches or visible emotion, because the Spartan system did not encourage such displays, but instead he began the process that would define the opening of this defense, the selection of the men who would accompany him north, not as a full army, but as a deliberate, and carefully chosen force that would represent both Sparta and the alliance it now led. The number was small, only 300 Spartan citizens, yet this number did not reflect weakness or hesitation, but rather the constraints under which Sparta operated, shaped by religious observances such as the Carnea festival, by the need to maintain stability within the city, and by the understanding that this initial force would act as a holding presence rather than a final stand, at least in its original conception. The selection itself was not random, and it did not focus solely on physical strength, because every Spartan warrior had already been shaped by years of training, by the agog, by shared hardship, and by the expectation of discipline. But instead, Leonidas chose men who were in their prime, experienced, reliable, and able to maintain cohesion under pressure. Men whose presence in the line would not falter when faced with uncertainty. Later traditions would suggest that these men were selected because they had living sons, ensuring that their family lines would continue, and whether this detail reflects strict reality or later interpretation, it carries a deeper meaning about how Sparta viewed sacrifice, not as an isolated act, but as something connected to continuity, to the endurance of the city beyond the lives of individuals. As preparations began, the atmosphere in Sparta remained outwardly controlled because the culture of the city discouraged visible expressions of fear or grief. Yet beneath that surface, there existed a quiet awareness of what this march might become, an understanding that this was not a routine campaign, but something different, something shaped by the scale of the approaching force and by the nature of the position they intended to hold. The men prepared their equipment with care, checking bronze helmets for fit and stability, examining breastplates and linen armor for strength, tightening straps on greaves, and inspecting the large round shields that would form the core of their defensive formation. Spears were tested for straightness, their wooden shafts balanced for both reach and control, and short swords were carried as a secondary weapon, intended for use when the distance between opponents collapsed and the fight became close and personal. Each Spartan warrior was accompanied by helot attendants, individuals bound to serve and support, who carried additional equipment, provisions, and supplies necessary for the march. And while their presence often remains in the background of popular retellings, they were an essential part of the logistical structure that allowed Spartan forces to move efficiently and maintain readiness. The column that formed was therefore not just a line of warriors, but a small moving system, organized, disciplined, and prepared for sustained movement rather than rapid engagement. When the time came to depart, the movement of the column through Sparta did not resemble a dramatic farewell, but instead unfolded with the same controlled rhythm that defined every aspect of Spartan life, as families observed from doorways and streets without outward display, and the warriors moved forward in formation, shields carried on the left arm, spears angled upward to avoid striking those ahead, and the pace set not by urgency, but by endurance. The road north stretched ahead, and with each step, the significance of the march grew, not because of what was immediately visible, but because of what lay beyond, an unseen force moving in the opposite direction, closing the distance with each passing day. As Leonidas and his men traveled, they did not move in isolation, because the road itself became a gathering point, drawing in contingents from other Greek cities, each bringing their own soldiers, their own leaders, and their own expectations. Some joined with confidence, seeing in the presence of a Spartan king a signal that the alliance was real and that resistance was possible, while others approached with caution, aware that cooperation with Sparta also meant accepting its leadership and the authority that came with it. The movement of these groups created a gradual accumulation of force, transforming the initial Spartan contingent into the core of a larger, though still limited, defensive presence. The journey itself followed a disciplined routine, with early starts before the heat of the day, steady pacing to conserve energy, and regular but brief stops for water and food, as the men maintained their focus not on conversation or distraction, but on the practical requirements of movement. Camps were established in the evenings with efficiency, fires lit in controlled locations, watch rotations assigned, and equipment kept close at hand, ensuring that the force remained ready, even during rest. Leonidas kept his interactions with allied leaders concise, focusing on coordination, timing, and the practical aspects of the defense they were approaching, rather than engaging in extended debate. As the column moved further north, the landscape began to change, gradually shifting from open roads and scattered settlements to a terrain that felt more confined, more shaped by natural boundaries. And this change signaled their approach to the place that had been chosen as the point of resistance, Thermopylae. The pass itself did not immediately appear as a dramatic location, but rather as a narrow stretch of land where the mountains pressed close to the sea, where the ground limited movement, and where the presence of hot springs added a distinct smell to the air, creating an environment that was both natural and strategically significant. Upon arrival, Leonidas did not rush into preparation, but instead took time to observe the terrain directly, walking sections of the pass, examining the ground where men would stand, identifying points where the formation could hold strongest, and considering the possible routes an enemy might take to bypass the position. His approach reflected the practical mindset of a commander who understood that success would depend not only on courage, but on the effective use of space, on ensuring that the advantages of the terrain were fully realized and that potential weaknesses were addressed before they could be exploited. One of the first actions taken by the Greeks was the repair of an old defensive wall that had been built long before, a structure that had fallen into disrepair but still provided a foundation for strengthening the position. Stones were lifted, gaps were filled, and the wall was restored into a functional barrier that could anchor the defensive line, turning the natural constriction of the pass into a more defined point of resistance. This work was not dramatic, but it was essential, transforming the location from a passive landscape into an active defense. As more allied forces arrived, the numbers at Thermopylae grew beyond the initial Spartan contingent, including troops from various cities such as Tegea, Mantinea, Corinth, and Thespiae, each contributing to the overall defense and while the total force remained small compared to the Persian army, it was organized with a clear structure, with Leonidas holding overall command and allied leaders managing their own contingents within that framework. Instructions were given regarding positioning, rotation of units, and signals for movement, ensuring that when the moment came, the defense would function as a coordinated whole rather than a collection of independent groups. At the same time, attention was given to the surrounding terrain, particularly the mountain paths that could potentially allow an enemy to bypass the pass, and forces were assigned to guard these routes, including a contingent from Phocis tasked with monitoring the higher ground. This decision reflected an awareness of the risks inherent in relying on a narrow defensive position, acknowledging that while the pass offered significant advantages, it was not completely secure, and that vigilance would be required beyond the immediate front line. As the preparations were completed, the camp at Thermopylae settled into a tense but controlled routine, with soldiers maintaining their equipment, practicing formations, and awaiting the arrival of the Persian army, while scouts moved ahead to gather information and runners carried updates between locations. The sea remained visible from parts of the position, a constant reminder of the broader strategy that linked the land defense to the actions of the Greek fleet at Artemisium, and the success of one depended on the stability of the other. And so, as the days passed, and the road to the north remained empty for moments at a time before filling again with distant signs of movement, the men at Thermopylae stood ready, their preparations complete, their formation defined, and their understanding clear that they were about to face not just an army, but the full weight of an empire that had been moving toward them long before they ever took their place at the pass. By the time the waiting at Thermopylae had settled into a quiet routine of preparation, observation, and controlled anticipation, the distant movement that had been spoken of for weeks finally began to take visible form, not all at once, but gradually, first through the appearance of small groups of scouts who moved ahead of the main Persian force, riding carefully along the road, stopping often to observe the terrain, to measure distances, and to study the narrow passage where the Greek defenders had taken their position. These scouts did not rush forward recklessly, because their purpose was not to fight, but to understand, to see how the pass had been prepared, to estimate the number of defenders, and to report back to the vast force that followed behind them, a force that had not yet fully revealed itself, but whose presence could already be sensed in the growing stillness that settled over the land. From the Greek side, these first sightings were met not with alarm, but with a steady and controlled readiness, as soldiers remained in position behind the repaired wall, their shields resting against their legs, their spears held upright, their attention fixed forward, while the routines of the camp continued behind them, men sharpening weapons, checking armor, and carrying out the quiet tasks that sustain a force preparing for battle. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden movement, because the arrival of the Persian army had always been expected, and the purpose of holding the pass was not to avoid this moment, but to meet it with discipline and structure. Soon after, the scouts withdrew, carrying with them the confirmation that the Greeks had chosen to stand, and this report moved quickly through the Persian ranks until it reached Xerxes I himself, who had advanced with his army and now approached the pass with the confidence of a ruler, accustomed to seeing resistance dissolve when confronted with overwhelming force. When the main body of the Persian army began to arrive, it did not appear as a single overwhelming wave, but as a continuous flow, infantry followed by cavalry, then more infantry, then wagons and animals, each part of the army taking its place within an organized structure that reflected the scale and experience of the empire. The Persian camp formed across the open ground beyond the pass, expanding outward as tents were raised, fires were lit, and units established their positions, creating a vast and complex arrangement that stretched beyond what the Greek defenders could fully see at once. Yet even from their limited vantage point, the scale was unmistakable as movement continued throughout the camp. Men organizing supplies, animals being watered, officers moving between units, and the constant background noise of a large army settling into place. The diversity of the Persian force was visible in the variation of clothing, weapons, and equipment, as soldiers from different regions stood side by side, each bringing their own style of warfare into a single coordinated effort, creating a presence that was both impressive and intimidating. Despite this display of strength, Xerxes did not immediately order an attack, because he understood that victory could often be achieved without unnecessary loss. And so he chose to wait, expecting that the Greek defenders, when faced with the reality of his army's size, would abandon their position and withdraw rather than face certain destruction. This pause extended over several days, during which both sides observed each other, the Persians watching for signs of weakness or hesitation, and the Greeks maintaining their positions with steady discipline, neither advancing nor retreating, but simply holding, as if the passage itself had become a boundary between two different understandings of power. Within the Greek camp, the waiting carried its own weight, as soldiers rose each morning, took their places along the wall, and watched the activity across the open ground, aware that the moment of contact could come at any time, yet also aware that their role required patience as much as readiness. The presence of the Persian army did not change their formation, did not disrupt their routines, but instead reinforced the importance of maintaining order, of conserving energy, and of trusting in the structure that had been established. Eventually, when it became clear that the Greeks would not withdraw, Xerxes shifted his approach and sent a messenger to the Greek line, offering terms that reflected the standard practice of the empire, presenting submission as a practical choice that would preserve life while integrating the defeated into the Persian system. The messenger approached under a flag of truce, accompanied by interpreters, and was met by Greek officers who stepped forward from the line, among them Leonidas I, who stood not as a figure of dramatic defiance, but as a commander who had already accepted the reality of the situation and understood that his response would define the tone of what followed. The message was delivered clearly, demanding that the Greeks lay down their weapons and submit to the authority of the Persian king, framing the situation as a choice between survival and destruction. And for a moment, the air between the two sides held a quiet tension as the words settled and the expectation of response hung in place. Leonidas did not hesitate, did not seek to negotiate or delay, but answered with a simplicity that carried both defiance and clarity, telling the messenger to come and take the weapons, a response that did not rely on elaborate language, but instead expressed a direct understanding that the position would not be surrendered voluntarily. When this reply reached Xerxes, it marked the end of waiting and the beginning of action, as the decision was made to force the pass, to break the Greek line through repeated assaults, and to demonstrate that even a narrow position could not withstand the sustained pressure of the Persian army. The first attack began with infantry advancing toward the pass in organized formations, their movement controlled at first, then accelerating as they approached the narrow opening where the Greek defenders had positioned themselves behind the repaired wall. The initial clash revealed immediately the effect of the terrain, as the narrow space limited the number of Persian soldiers who could engage at once, forcing them into a confined area where their numbers could not be fully utilized, and where the Greek hoplites, standing shoulder to shoulder with shields overlapping and spears extended, created a dense and disciplined front that absorbed the impact of the attack. The Persian soldiers, equipped for speed and flexibility, attempted to push forward, but found themselves meeting a barrier that did not break, as Greek spears struck with controlled precision, targeting faces, throats, and exposed areas, then withdrawing to strike again, maintaining a rhythm that relied on coordination rather than individual action. As the battle continued, the pressure within the narrow pass increased, with soldiers pushing from behind, adding force to the front lines, but also creating congestion that limited movement and visibility, making it difficult for those further back to understand the situation ahead. The ground quickly became uneven as bodies fell and obstacles formed, complicating footing and increasing the difficulty of maintaining momentum. The Greeks, protected by their heavier armor and supported by the structure of their formation, used this environment to their advantage, holding their position while rotating soldiers in and out of the front line to manage fatigue and maintain effectiveness. Xerxes, observing the progress of the battle, responded by sending additional troops, including elite units trained for combat and expected to break through where others had failed. Yet even these forces struggled within the constraints of the pass, as the same limitations applied to them, preventing them from deploying their full strength and forcing them into the same confined engagement where the Greek formation remained effective. The repeated assaults continued throughout the day, each wave meeting the same resistance, each attempt failing to create a breakthrough, and as losses mounted, it became clear that the narrow space had transformed the battle into a test, not of numbers, but of discipline and endurance. By the end of the first day, the Persian forces withdrew to regroup, leaving the ground before the pass covered with the fallen, while the Greek defenders remained in position, maintaining their formation, tending to the wounded, and preparing for the next assault, aware that the battle was not yet decided, but also aware that they had held against the initial pressure of an army far larger than their own. The second day began with renewed Persian efforts, as attacks resumed with increased intensity, attempting to exploit any weakness or fatigue that might have developed. Yet the Greek defense continued to function with the same disciplined coordination, adjusting positions, rotating units, and maintaining the integrity of the shield wall. At times, the Greeks advanced slightly beyond the wall, engaging the enemy in controlled movements before withdrawing again to their prepared positions, using these maneuvers to disrupt the Persian formations and manage the accumulation of bodies that obstructed the narrow front. Despite the persistence of the Persian assaults and the introduction of fresh troops, the outcome of the second day mirrored that of the first. As the Greek line held, the terrain continued to limit the effectiveness of the attacking force, and the defenders maintained their structure under pressure. For Xerxes, this result represented not only a tactical challenge but also a disruption of expectation, as the anticipated quick collapse of the Greek position had not occurred, and the continued resistance of a relatively small force began to carry implications beyond the immediate battlefield. As the day ended and both sides returned to their camps, the situation remained unresolved, with the Greek defenders still holding the pass, the Persian army still seeking a way to break through, and the narrow strip of land at Thermopylae becoming the focal point of a struggle that had grown more complex than either side had initially anticipated, as strength alone had proven insufficient, and the outcome now depended on finding a way to overcome not just the defenders, but the constraints of the environment itself. As the second day of fighting at Thermopylae came to a close, and both armies withdrew into their camps to rest, reorganize, and prepare for what would follow, there existed, for a brief moment, a fragile balance between the two sides, a pause in which the Greek defenders still held the narrow pass, and the Persian army, despite its immense size, had not yet found a way to break through. Yet beneath this surface of repetition and endurance, something had already begun to shift, not on the open ground, where the battles had been fought, but in the quiet movement of individuals, in decisions made away from the line of shields, and in the existence of paths that had not yet been tested in the context of this conflict. Among those who lived in the region surrounding the pass was a man named Ephialtes of Trachis, who understood the terrain not as a distant observer, but as someone familiar with its hidden routes, its slopes, and the narrow paths that wound through the mountains above the main road. These paths had been known to the Greeks and had been assigned guards, yet they remained a point of vulnerability, not because they were unknown, but because they required constant vigilance, and because the success of the defense depended on more than just the strength of the line at the front. Ephialtes, motivated by the promise of reward and favor, made a decision that would alter the course of the battle, choosing to approach the Persian camp under cover of darkness and offer information that would allow the army of Xerxes I to bypass the narrow pass entirely. The offer was received with careful attention, as Persian officers questioned him in detail, seeking confirmation that the path he described was real, that it led to a position behind the Greek defenders, and that it could be used by a force large enough to influence the outcome of the battle. When his knowledge proved consistent with what scouts had already suspected, the decision was made quickly, and preparations began for a movement that would take place not in the open, but in silence, guided by the terrain itself, rather than by formation or visibility. Under the cover of night, a selected Persian force assembled with minimal noise, carrying light equipment suitable for movement through uneven ground, and guided by Ephialtes, they began the ascent into the mountains, moving along the path that curved above the pass, their progress marked not by the clash of weapons, but by the quiet sound of footsteps on stone, the occasional shift of loose ground, and the controlled signals of officers ensuring that the column remained intact. The climb was not easy, as the terrain demanded careful movement, with narrow sections forcing the men into single file, and uneven footing requiring constant attention. Yet the discipline of the force allowed them to maintain their progress, advancing steadily toward their objective. Along this path, the Greek guards assigned to protect the route, primarily Phocian troops, detected the movement as faint sounds in the darkness, and as the realization of what was happening began to take shape, they raised the alarm and prepared to engage. The initial contact was brief and sharp, with arrows and spears exchanged in the confined space. But the Persian objective was not to stop and fight for control of the high ground, but to continue their advance, to move past the defenders and reach the position behind the main Greek line. As the Phocians withdrew to a more defensible position, expecting a direct assault, the Persian force instead pressed forward along the path, leaving behind a portion of troops to contain the guards, while the main body continued toward the rear of the pass. As dawn approached, the implications of this movement began to reach the Greek camp, carried by runners who descended the slopes with urgency, delivering reports that were clear in their meaning, that the Persians had found a way around the pass, that the defensive position would soon be threatened from both directions, and that the situation had fundamentally changed. When this information reached Leonidas I, he did not react with confusion or panic, but with the same controlled focus that had defined his leadership from the beginning, calling together the allied commanders and presenting the situation in practical terms, outlining the reality that the pass could no longer be held in the same way, and that a decision would need to be made immediately. The discussion that followed was not about whether the Persians could be stopped indefinitely, because that possibility had already passed, but about what could still be achieved, about how the remaining time could be used, and about which forces would withdraw and which would remain. Some argued for retreat, recognizing that staying in the pass under these conditions would lead to encirclement and destruction, while others spoke of duty, of holding the position as long as possible to allow others to escape and to continue the defense further south. Leonidas listened, weighed the options, and then gave a clear order that balanced necessity with purpose, instructing the majority of the Allied forces to withdraw while there was still time, to preserve their strength for future battles, while he and a smaller group would remain to hold the pass for as long as possible. The withdrawal began quickly, but not chaotically, as units gathered their equipment, formed lines, and moved south along the road, maintaining as much order as possible under the pressure of time, carrying the wounded when they could, supporting those who struggled, and leaving behind those who would not depart. Among those who chose to remain were the Spartans, bound by their king and by the expectations of their society, and the Thespians, who made their own decision to stay, not compelled by law but by choice, understanding the consequences and accepting them without hesitation. As the remaining defenders prepared for the final phase of the battle, the Persian forces began to close in from both directions, with the main army advancing from the front and the flanking force descending from the mountains to the rear, creating a situation in which the Greek position would be compressed, surrounded, and eventually overwhelmed. Leonidas adjusted the formation, moving the defenders into a more flexible position that allowed them to fight on slightly more open ground, avoiding immediate confinement and giving them space to maneuver as long as possible. When the final engagement began, it did not resemble the earlier days of controlled defense, but instead became a compressed and intense struggle, with attacks coming from multiple directions, forcing the defenders to shift their focus constantly, to maintain cohesion while responding to pressure from both front and rear. The Spartans and their allies fought with the same discipline that had held the pass, their shields overlapping, their spears thrusting in coordinated movements. Yet the increasing pressure and the limited space gradually reduced their ability to maintain the same level of organization. In the midst of this fighting, Leonidas himself fell, struck down during the close combat that had become unavoidable, and his death marked a moment that did not stop the battle, but changed its character, as the defenders surged to protect his body, forming a tight ring around it, fighting with renewed intensity to prevent it from being taken by the enemy. This struggle added another layer to the conflict, as Persian soldiers attempted to seize the body as a symbol of victory, while the Greeks fought to preserve it, creating a concentrated point of violence within an already intense engagement. As the battle continued, the defenders were gradually pushed back toward a small rise behind the pass, where they formed a final position, their numbers reduced, their weapons damaged, many fighting now with broken spears or short swords, yet still maintaining the core principle of their defense, standing together, holding formation, and resisting until no further resistance was possible. The Persian forces, recognizing that the remaining defenders could not be broken quickly through direct assault alone, brought forward archers, and from a distance, arrows began to fall into the confined group, striking shields, armor, and exposed bodies, gradually reducing the number of those still able to fight. In those final moments, the battle ceased to be about strategy or position, and became instead a matter of endurance and inevitability, as the remaining defenders, surrounded and outnumbered, continued to fight until they were overcome, their formation collapsing, not through disorder, but through the simple reality that no group, no matter how disciplined, can resist indefinitely against such overwhelming force. When the fighting ended, the pass fell silent, and the Persian army moved forward, stepping over the remains of the battle, clearing the road, reorganizing their forces, and continuing their advance south, having achieved their immediate objective, yet at a cost that had been visible to all who had witnessed the struggle. Xerxes, observing the aftermath, saw not only victory, but also the evidence of resistance that had delayed his campaign, and demonstrated that even a small force, positioned correctly and led with discipline, could impose a significant cost on a much larger army. The story, however, did not end at Thermopylae, because the time gained by the defense allowed the Greek cities to continue their preparations, to coordinate their forces, and to eventually confront the Persian invasion in later battles, where the balance of power would shift, and where the outcome of the wider conflict would be decided. Yet Thermopylae remained, not because it was a victory, but because of what it represented. A moment where choice, duty, and circumstance aligned in a way that created something lasting, something that could be remembered and retold, not as a simple tale of heroism, but as a reflection of how individuals and societies respond when faced with overwhelming odds. And now, as the story comes to rest, imagine that narrow pass once more, not filled with soldiers, not echoing with the sound of battle, but quiet again, the sea moving slowly beside it, the wind passing through the mountains, the ground unchanged, yet forever marked. The men who stood there are gone, their voices long silent, and yet the memory remains, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, a reminder that sometimes history is not shaped by those who win, but by those who choose to stand, even when they know they cannot. Now, take a slow breath, let the story fade gently, and allow yourself to rest.